shall we? I don't know if you guys knew this about me, but I'm from Indiana originally. We're called Hoosiers out there for whatever reason. We don't know why. Okay, we don't know what Hoosiers even means. It's just like an old wives' tale. Like apparently, like there was like some kind of a bar fight, and someone came up, they found an ear laying down on the ground that said "Who's ear?" And so the name Hoosier stuck. Go figure. But I grew up in Indiana, and I loved my hometown. Indiana was good to me. Richmond, Indiana was good to me. I'm a farmer's kid, right? So I particularly have this deep appreciation for Midwest country, cornfields everywhere, I grew up picking up rocks. It was a dream, more or less. But the thing that I never thought that I would take for granted being from Indiana is that we actually have trees out there, right? Like just like so many different like patches of woods and forests, like just everywhere. Then you come out here and you're like, oh wow, there's nothing out here, But even though I took that for granted, we didn't have any trees, something that I never thought was ever going to be possible was that I would find my home out here in South Dakota. Because when I graduated from Indiana Wesleyan University in 2016, I wound up taking my first job in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, at a church called The Ransom. And I'll be fully honest, I completely forgot South Dakota was even a state. I really did. Let alone, Brandon's too. And honestly, I was pretty surprised that there was even civilization out here. Maybe is it still like buggies and stuff out here? Who knows? But I moved out here to Sioux Falls, 2016, and completely fell in love with this place. Not just because I found community and family and just experienced a lot of my own life transformation here, but there is also something about this desire of leaving what was always known to me, a common place in Indiana, and going to some place new. I love Indiana. I love my hometown and everything. All that's good. But I wanted to get out there somewhere new, and I was completely mesmerized by the nothingness out here. Like, I'm being honest. Like, there is a beautiful nothingness to South Dakota. The fact that you can see for miles, you cross Chamberlain over the Missouri River, and you get to these wide rolling hills. I've never seen anything like it. Whenever my wife and I go out to the hills for annual family reunions with her family, I bug out every time. These hills, they never end. It blows my mind. And then, of course, there's that point, maybe if you've headed west on I-90, where you just finally get over that hill and you see the Black Hills coming, right? It's like you're finally getting to some civilization at that point, and a bunch of pine trees. There's truly about winding up in a new place. There's truly something special about winding up in a new place because we're mesmerized by going into new places, aren't we? We're mesmerized about it. I mean, North Central Indiana is great in its own way. Southeast South Dakota is marvelous and all that, but we all know that there's also so much more to the world than just South Dakota. Praise God, right? Praise God. Because whatever fits your cup of tea, you just go a couple thousand miles away and you'll find yourselves on a beach, a sandy shore, maybe with some palm trees, right? Man, we love that. I think all of us would like to be there right now, Or perhaps on the other side of the country, you can get to these beautiful canyons and gorges that you could hike and climb. Unreal, right? Or the luscious forests that you could find in like the redwood trees out in California. Or coral reefs if you're a snorkeler, if you like to do that. You can just be amazed at this whole other world that lives under the sea. Under the sea. Under the sea. Not to mention the Rocky Mountains, right? Just a ways west. And you're transported to a whole other world. These places are unreal. We are mesmerized by new places. And I believe the reason why is because there's also a level of dissatisfaction with staying where we are. We're mesmerized by new places because to a certain extent, we're dissatisfied with always staying put in the same place, right? And perhaps there are many of us here this morning who aren't content staying put. And I'm not just talking about, staying put here in Vermilion. We love Vermilion, truly. But perhaps staying put with your own life spiritually. Where you want to go to an entirely new place in your own life, to ascend to greater heights, to overcome obstacles that have been plaguing you for way too long. You're finally ready to go there. go to a new place. That's what we're talking about. We're starting a new series this weekend called Ascend, where we're going to be really wrestling with this idea of ascending to new heights, getting out of the ruts perhaps that we find ourselves in. I mean, it's New Year's, right? This is a time of year where we just kind of look back at our last year and just become really dissatisfied with who we are, where all the things that we did wrong become blatantly obvious, and then we set all these goals for the new things that we want to do, that we want to become, that often fail within the first 2 weeks, right? It's typically what happens. But this is what's fresh on our mind. And this is what we're going to be tackling over these next 5 weeks. And we're going to be looking deeply into one particular story called the Transfiguration. Everybody say that back to me. It's Transfiguration. So good. Not Transformers. Transfiguration. One more time. Transfiguration. Say that. You guys are so good. You're so good. Over the next 5 weeks, we're going to be looking at this one particular story that really covers this idea of ascending to new heights well. So, how about we just start off with a wide view of the whole story, then over these next several weeks, we're going to break it down bit by bit. So let's read the whole story in its entirety, beginning in Matthew chapter 17, verses 1 through 13. After 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John, the brother of James, and led them up a high mountain by themselves. There he was transfigured before them. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became as white as the light. Just then there appeared before them Moses and Elijah talking to Jesus. Peter said to Jesus, "Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I will put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." While he was still speaking, a bright cloud covered them, and a voice from the cloud said, "This is my son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." When the disciples heard this, they fell face down to the ground, terrified. But Jesus came and touched them. "Get up," he said. "Don't be afraid." When they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus instructed them, "Don't tell anyone what you have seen until the Son of Man has been raised from the dead." The disciples asked him, "Why then do the teachers of the law say that Elijah must come first?" Jesus replied, "To be sure, Elijah comes and will restore all things. But I tell you, Elijah has already come, and they did not recognize him, but have done to him everything they wished. The same way, the Son of Man is going to suffer at their hands." Then the disciples understood that he was talking to them about John the Baptist. There it is. All right, there it is. Our story in its entirety. We're going to be diving into this over the next 5 weeks. And today, we're focusing on verse 1. That's it. Verse 1. So let's go back and reread verse 1. After 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John, the brother of James, and led them up a high mountain by themselves. So there's already a lot to unpack in this first verse. Because from this first verse, we have 2 key questions that arise. First, why does Jesus take these 3 disciples up a mountain? Okay, that's the first question. Why does Jesus take the 3 disciples up a mountain, of all things? Then the second question that we'll address later is, why did he choose these 3 particular disciples? Okay? So let's talk about this first one. Why a mountain? Why a mountain? So, as it turns out, in ancient times, people believed that the gods resided on top of mountains, right? Anybody ever seen Hercules, the Disney classic? Show of hands, right? What's on top of Mount Olympus? This place, this magical place where all the different gods and their colorful forms and everything live in paradise, well above all the stuff that happens here on earth, that it is on top of Mount Olympus. That's where that all happens. And in a similar way, the Old Testament in particular believed that God, our God, was present on mountains in a very special way. Not that he was more present on top of mountains, but that he was present in these different tangible ways. You see stories of incredible things happening on top of mountains. In fact, Jesus is here talking with these 2 guys named Elijah and Moses, both who had stories that happened on top of mountains. Moses received the law and the 10 Commandments on top of Mount Sinai. Elijah slayed a bunch of prophets of Baal. It's a really gruesome story. On top of Mount Carmel. Mountains. They're everywhere. And those are just a couple of the references that are taking place. So it's no coincidence that this incredible story of Jesus transfiguring before the disciples is happening on top of a mountain, because it's on top of mountains when God does crazy stuff. Oftentimes. All right? So that is the significance of why they're on top of a mountain, because clearly something crazy happens. But I want to bounce back a little bit to what we were talking about this morning. We're mesmerized by new places. We're mesmerized by going to all of these different areas and environments. And something we tend to take for granted is that we as physical creatures live in physical landscapes our entire life, environments. In fact, to be a living creature means to live in specific environments in which we thrive and survive. And these environments are more specifically known as habitats, right? Habitats. This is some quick fifth grade science review. Some of the different habitats that different animals can live in are the deserts, the plains, the mountains, or my personal favorite, the tundra. The tundra is the best of the habitats, in my personal opinion. You can fight me on that later. I always wanted to go to Alaska and see the tundra. Tundra. You just have to say it that way. It's tundra. Okay, I'm sorry. In the tundra, amongst many other things, oceans, right, the Arctic, all of those different things. And here's what's very, very important, is that the animals who inhabit these habitats survive and thrive because of their habits. In other words, your habitats determine your habits. Your habitat determines your habits. Or in other words, where you live determines how you live. You tracking? So you have an animal who lives in a certain habitat with certain habits to survive and thrive in that habitat. But what happens if you take that animal from its habitat and move it somewhere else? Okay? So here's an example. We got some little pictures here of some penguins. Aww, so cute, right? What would happen if we take these penguins, who thrive in Antarctica, and we move them to Vermilion in the middle of a hot, blistery summer day? They're gonna, it's a beach day, except they're gonna die, right? So penguins are not designed to survive and thrive in heat waves. Likewise, what if we were to transport ourselves in our current state down to Antarctica? We swap places, right? We go to this different kind of habitat. If we try to live there with our current habits of just wearing, hoodies out in minus 20-degree weather because we're crazy, we'll probably die. Our habits are not fit for those habitats unless we change our habits. I'm sure, I have no doubt, that penguins could survive here in the summer if we simply just put them in an ice cooler the whole time, right? Granted, they can't walk around anywhere. They have to change their habits, but they could survive in this habitat. Likewise, if we were to go down to Antarctica, it feels like we've been living in it the last couple of days, hasn't it? The last couple of weeks. We'd have to drastically change our habits. We'd have to sleep in thermal wear. We'd have to be in very special tents. Like, there's just so much stuff we have to do to survive and thrive down there, but it's possible. But it requires us changing our habits. And if that's the case for us entering new physical habitats, the same is true for spiritual habitats. Spiritual habitats. Because just as there are physical habitats like mountains and deserts and oceans and tundra, right? There's also spiritual habitats. Perhaps where you look inside your life and you just feel like you're living in a valley, a dark valley. Perhaps it's a canyon, maybe a cave, maybe it's deep under the ocean where you just feel overwhelmed and dark and lost. And the habits that you form to live in there, maybe you thrive, but they're not healthy. You're not content with that. And so naturally, maybe you're living in these habitats and maybe you're surviving, but that's pretty much the extent of it. You're not thriving. You look at the friends that you're with and they tempt you to do things that you don't want to do. Perhaps when you go back home, you dread even going back home to that habitat because your parents just always fight all the time and you wonder, why am I even here? Maybe you just don't feel like you're appreciated at work. So your work habitat just really weighs on you personally, spiritually. Or maybe you just live in a habitat that's filled with noise and chaos and destruction, and it just forces your habits, your daily life decisions, just to try to survive in this environment, but you're not pleased with it. And you want to change these habits, you want to change these parts of your life, but so doing requires you to go to a new habitat. You see? You can't change your habits unless you go to a new habitat. And that applies not just physically, but spiritually as well. So perhaps you might find yourself here today, desperate for life change, and you're willing to go anywhere and do anything to get it, to finally get out of this valley and go to someplace new, to ascend to new heights. But can I tell you, there is hope. There's actually a spiritual habitat where all of this can happen, plus some. And it's the mountain of God. It's the mountain of God. This is actually a thing that's referenced throughout Scripture in a lot of ways. The mountain of God, not just as a physical place. It was often where they referenced the temple of Jerusalem and everything there. But it was also this metaphorical place where you can meet God in powerful ways and to seek his face and all of these other things. Isaiah 2, verse 3 is actually a great example of this. People from many nations will come and say, "Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of Jacob's God. There he will teach us his ways, and we will walk in his paths." The mountain of God is a place where we can meet God face to face, where we can meet him in a powerful way that gives us joy and a peace that surpasses understanding, where we can learn his ways and finally change those habits that we are just sick of, right? To finally get on the life that he has for us, to go someplace new. And as I said, maybe you feel like you've been living in the spiritual valley for a long time. You've been cruising a 990 and there's nothing there. And then just over the horizon, you see those hills. You see that greenery. You see those peaks. And you're like, I want to get there. I want to go there. I want to ascend those heights. But except for you, maybe it's not the Black Hills, maybe it's the mountain of God, where joy and peace and learning and growth and purpose happens. It's just on the horizon, you're standing at the base, and you want to get up there and finally have the stuff that that mountain represents, to ascend that mountain. Tracking? That's why Jesus is going up on this mountaintop. That's what this represents when we see it, and that's why this is so significant to understand the power of mountaintops in God's story as we read the rest of it, as we journey through this over the next couple of weeks, okay? That answers question number one. Why the mountain? Why is that significant? But then we got the second question. Why these three yahoos? Why Peter, James, and John of all people? Why does he take these three disciples up this mountain to follow Jesus, to experience God in this transformational way? Because Jesus had a ton of disciples. He had a ton of disciples. 12 of them happened to follow him the most closely. But then you had these three guys. But you see, this was really intentional. He chose Peter, James, and John for a reason. It's not like they just all, drew straws and whoever got, the three shortest had to trek up with Jesus on top of this mountain. No, there's a backstory to these three people. There's a long history with Jesus that they have that no other disciples have. This is why I think Jesus chose them. If you bounce back to Matthew chapter 4, we find that the very first people Jesus calls to follow him included Peter, James, and John. But what we have to understand that's so unique about that story is they gave up everything to follow Jesus. Everything. They gave up job security. They gave up their homes. They even left their families to follow this stranger that they believed was sent by God to do incredible things. They didn't know he was the Son of God just yet, but they knew he was something different. And they left all of that. To put it another way, these three disciples gave up everything to follow Jesus. Everything. That's their story. The only way they could have done that if they were discontent with staying where they were, wanted to follow Jesus someplace else. See that? Not just physically, but also spiritually, because they traveled all over the place down there. So check this out. So if we go back to verse 1, here's what it says. After 6 days, Jesus took these three guys up this mountain. That begs the question, what happened 6 days earlier? What happened 6 days earlier that led them to this journey? So if we actually bounce back to Matthew chapter 16, this is the story that takes place right before they go up to this mountain. This is what happens 6 days prior. Jesus is hanging out with his 12 disciples at a place called Caesarea Philippi, and it was here that Jesus reveals that he is the Messiah. He is the chosen one, sent by God to establish God's kingdom and to redeem the people of Israel and to bring salvation to the rest of the world. It was crazy, and it blew the disciples' minds. They're like, surely he is the Son of God. This is where they revealed truly how special Jesus was. But when they hear that Jesus confesses that he is the Messiah, they have a completely different image of what that means. They thought that meant that Jesus was a political leader. They thought he was a revolutionist. And they thought that he was ultimately going to bring down the Roman Empire in some sort of revolutionary war. To their disappointment, that's not what Jesus had in mind. Far from it. Far from it. Instead, after he reveals that he's truly the Son of God, he says that he will have to suffer and die in order to establish this new kingdom. Doesn't sound like a war hero, does it? And after he rebukes Peter, who says, you surely can't die, and he calls him Satan, that whole exchange, he repeats a message that I think goes back to why Peter, James, and John left everything to follow Jesus in the first place. Here's what Jesus says in Matthew 16, verses 24 through 25. Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will find it. Anyone who wants to follow Jesus and the path that he has in store for them, the places that he has, you do that by picking up your cross. To the disciples, that was literally a death sentence. To follow him to where Jesus wanted them to go. Denying yourself as an act of pledging their allegiance to him as their Lord. And these three disciples, Peter, James, and John, they exercised that perfectly, and that's why they immediately entered into Jesus' inner circle of disciples, and I believe that is why Jesus invites them to come and just check out exactly what happens when Jesus gets by himself away on top of mountains with God, his Father. So here's what this means for us. Perhaps you're not content with where you are this season. Maybe you are desperate to ascend to new heights, right? You want to go to this new place that God has in store for you. And maybe it's not even that things are bad, but things could be better. And God is giving you a way to do that. He truly is. He's giving every single one of us that opportunity. But here's the deal. You've got to give up everything. Pledge your life to Jesus. If you truly want to see that happen, you have to give up everything to follow Jesus to ascend to these new heights. Because not just anyone can ascend the mountain of God. Just like how not everyone can climb Mount Everest, right? You have to have dedication and devotion. It's hard. It's so worth it. I invite Mason back up as we kind of move into our next little portion here of worship. But if you find yourselves here, standing in your valleys, maybe you know exactly what that one thing is. Maybe two things. Okay, I want you just to think about and ponder, what's the thing you want to change this year? What's the habit you want to finally kick? What's the one new habit you want to ingrain? Maybe you've always wanted to pray more and you want to learn how to do that. Maybe you've always wanted to dive into Scripture and you want to do that. Maybe just showing up to church once a month is a big deal for you, right? Sharing your faith or becoming more personable, finally tackling that anger issue. Hello, that's me. What's the one thing that you want God to allow you to ascend to new heights, to overcome these obstacles and to become the person he's designed you for, okay? Tuck that in the back of your mind. So I'm going to pivot here. Did you know that you can't just show up to Mount Everest and just climb it? Actually, you have to go through a climbing party, in which case you have to sign a waiver. A waiver. Where they list out, all the various things that could possibly happen, that could lead you to your death and stuff before you do that, right? All these different disclosures, all these different liabilities and legal stuff and everything, basically to tell you, here's what you're signing up for. It is the adventure of a lifetime. But you have to recognize, here's all the risks, here's all the stuff you have to do, here's what could happen, yada, 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 yada. You know, all the fancy little 10-point font that we can never read, and we just, click, I agree to the terms of service, yeah, right? Whether it's climbing Mount Everest or whether you're going to the trampoline park at Air Madness or camps or whatever, what happens at the end of that waiver? You have to sign your name, don't you? You have to sign your name as your acknowledgement that you accept the risks, you accept the liabilities, you accept what could possibly happen if you journey this way forward. Yes, there's always risks, but man, if you push forward, it's going to be so worth it in the end. Once you acknowledge that, you sign your name. So, same thing is true for us. If you look around you, you got these little index cards on your chair coming in, and then there's a couple of pins floating around. If you need some, we got a couple extras here in the front. But during this next worship song, on one side of it, I want you to write out your waiver. In other words, who do you want to become this year? What's the one thing God's asking you to tackle, that new habit to bring, right? Well, whatever it is, only you know. Write it down, and I want you to think deeply. Okay, what do you want to start doing? What do you want to stop doing? What are you going to replace this habit with? Who are you going to invite into these conversations? How are you going to just think about the plan of what you're going to do, what God is asking you to do to ascend to new heights. Okay? You have this whole next song to think about. And when you're done, as your way of acknowledging, Jesus, I'm following you. This year's going to be different. I'm committing myself to this. I want you to sign your name. I want you to sign your name on the backside of that card, or wherever, and hang on to that. They actually say that your chances of actually accomplishing your goals just skyrockets when you write it down, so you're welcome. This is giving you a jump start. Just write it down. Pray over this. And of course, let us know how we can support you and pray alongside you. Because ascending God's mountain and undergoing life change is hard. It is not for the faint of heart. But it is so worth it. It's the way towards that vibrant life that we're all about here. This time of worship and reflection is yours. Respond as you will. We'll continue to give God the glory as we ascend to new heights this year.